They didn't call her a healer, they called her Krovoyarka, Blood Woman. In the cold plains of what is now southern Ukraine, that title carried weight heavier than a king's crown. Because when your child convulsed with fever and your livestock birthed deformed calves, it wasn't the gods you whispered to, it was her, the woman who scraped fat from corpses and brewed nightmares in bowls of bone. Her hut reeked of sulphur, wet fur, and singed hair, and her door was decorated not with charms, but with teeth. Sarmatian society, those fierce horse-riding confederations from the 5th century BCE, wasn't known for subtlety. Their warriors painted their faces with ash and adorned their saddles with human scalps. But even they lowered their voices when discussing the witch of the steppe. She had no name, at least not one people dared to speak. Her skin was etched with ritual burns. Her hair was a tangled mass stiff with oils, clays and things better left unnamed, but the most disturbing thing about her was how calmly she watched people suffer, as if pain were just another herb in her vast and grotesque apothecary. You're watching Hushed Historian, where truth whispers through time. If you enjoy what I dig up for you, subscribe so we don't lose our little historical connection. Thank you. By day, the Sarmatian witch walked the plains barefoot, wrapped in layers of wool soaked with goat's blood and ash. Her scent travelled before she did, a mixture of iron, rot, and bitter roots. By night, her fires crackled with herbs so pungent they made warriors hallucinate their ancestors crawling from the earth. She wasn't feared because she harmed people. She was feared because she healed them and made them wish they hadn't asked. Cures didn't come as powders or prayers. They came as screaming, smoke and scars. She treated seizures with bee stings to the eyelids. To stop a miscarriage, she'd bury a rooster alive while singing in a dead language. For fevers, she'd bind the patient's limbs and burn horsehair beneath their nostrils until they passed out, claiming the evil spirit had fled the body along with the scream. Healing to her was war, and she always won. But that wasn't even the worst part. Once a month during the black moon, when stars hid like cowards, she performed her most sacred ritual, the soul searing. Villagers who had been touched by the shadow, meaning they saw ghosts, heard voices, or simply couldn't stop crying, were brought to her shack, blindfolded and trembling. What happened next was never spoken of clearly. Some said she poured boiling sap into their ears. Others claimed she carved protective sigils on their tongues using obsidian, but what they all agreed on was the smell. Burnt bone, singed fat, and a kind of sourness that clung to the lungs. Afterward, the afflicted either came back sane or not at all. And yet, people kept coming, because when your baby gasped for air and your veins crawled with blackness, the gods were nowhere. But she always answered, always demanded payment too, sometimes in salt, sometimes in blood, sometimes in secrets you didn't want to remember. One woman claimed the witch made her confess to poisoning her sister. Another said she had to eat a raven's heart raw. No one lied to the witch. The truth was the currency she valued most. And let's be clear, she wasn't alone. Across the steppes, these blood women existed in clusters, keeping oral traditions alive like dying embers. They shared recipes for death and rebirth, passed down through cracked teeth and hushed songs. They were midwives, exorcists, necromancers, and sometimes executioners. But our witch, she was something darker, because one year she vanished. Her hut stood intact, the fire still smouldering, but she was gone. Except for one thing, a bowl of fresh blood on the hearth and a single word etched into the wall in claw marks. That word? Take. But take what? And who had she become? Let's go back a bit, to before she vanished, before the blood offering, before the whisper of take scraped itself into the wall, like a dying curse, before fear became fascination. She hadn't always been the woman whose breath made dogs whimper, and who could quiet a screaming man with a single glance. No, once, long ago, she had been a girl, small, silent, and sticky with afterbirth, born in the middle of a storm that tore a Sarmatian yurt clean in half. That was seen as an omen. Not a bad one. Not yet, just different. And Sarmatians feared different, the way others feared famine. They said she never cried as a baby. Not once. When her mother died, giving birth to a stillborn brother 2 years later, the girl didn't blink. Just walked out into the snow barefoot and came back with a dead fox cradled in her arms, like a doll. By 10, she could recite the names of all the herbs that made a man sleep, and the 3 that made him never wake again. She was taught by a blind widow named Alka, who claimed to have married a lightning bolt and kept her husband's voice in a jar. People assumed she was insane, but they still came to her with their boils and curses. Because in a world without doctors, madness was just another form of medicine. The girl was a quiet student. Too quiet. She dissected owls and moles without flinching, traced runes onto wet deer hides, and memorized chants older than the language her tribe spoke. One night, when Alka lay dying with a throat full of blood, the girl leaned over and whispered something in her ear. Alka smiled, and then bled out in silence. The girl didn't cry. She just took the old woman's fingers. 3 of them had been replaced with raven bones, and sewed them into a pouch she wore around her neck. That was the night the villagers stopped calling her by name. She had inherited something. Not just the hut or the spells, something older, something foul, and just when it couldn't get more absurd, she began to change. Her eyes clouded in the daylight. She started wearing veils soaked in goat milk to see properly. Her teeth yellowed, her fingernails thickened into claws. She began talking to bones. Not metaphorically, she would hang them from the rafters and listen, and they would answer, rattling, tapping, sometimes swinging so violently they cracked against each other, like hailstones. She claimed they told her who was next to die. She was never wrong. That sort of accuracy gets attention, and not the good kind. The tribe's Kargan, an aging man with more wives than wisdom, called her before the elders. He accused her of sowing fear, of summoning death, of being unnatural. She replied by reciting the Kargan's dreams from the past 6 nights, down to the number of rats in them. No one knew how she did it. She never left her hut, and yet her words peeled the blood from the man's face like steam. He dismissed her with a trembling hand, but from that day on, he avoided looking her in the eye. A man who'd once fed prisoners to wolves wouldn't even speak her name aloud. That was power, and power, left unchecked, festers. Soon, other witches came, not in daylight and never through the front. They slipped into her hut like shadows. Old women, hunched and blind in one eye, or girls with red welts circling their wrists from unholy initiations. They brought gifts, dried tongues, teeth, and mushrooms that bled when sliced. She never asked questions. She just added them to her shelf and gestured to the floor, where they'd sit for hours in silence. It was communion. No gods, no prayers, just exchange. Then one night, during a fever wind, a woman arrived, but she didn't kneel. She didn't speak. She carried a child, dead, eyes open, mouth sewn shut with horsehair. She placed the corpse at the witch's feet and simply said, "Bring her back." The witch stared. Then slowly, she smiled. If you think that's bad, wait until you hear what happened next. Because the witch didn't refuse. She didn't scream blasphemy or cast the child aside like spoiled meat. No, she knelt. Not to pray, but to listen. She placed her ear against the child's stiff chest and closed her eyes, whispering something that sounded less like a chant and more like a bargain. The fire behind her cracked once, and every bone hanging from the rafters swayed violently. The witch inhaled, deep and sharp, like tasting the wind for omens. Then she stood and said only one thing. "You will owe 3 things, and I will choose when." The mother didn't flinch. Grief is a kind of anesthesia. She just nodded and walked out, leaving the child behind like a package returned to sender. The witch took the little corpse and began her work. Not with herbs, not with prayers, but with knives. She peeled the skin from the soles of the feet, stuffed the mouth with ash and birch bark, and stitched a toad's tongue beneath the ribcage. Every movement was precise, mechanical. Like a woman following instructions she didn't need to read. For hours she laboured, until dawn smeared the sky in pinks and greys, and then In that first thin light, the child moved. Not much, just a twitch, but enough. The bones rattled in agreement. The villagers heard the scream a few moments later. High, cracked, and unmistakably human. A man out hunting swore he saw smoke rising in the shape of a face. Another claimed he found a deer carcass, with its eyes gouged out and mouth sewn shut, just like the child had been. And yet, when the mother returned 3 days later, her daughter stood in the doorway, smiling, pale as wax, with lips too red and fingers that trembled constantly. But breathing, and that was all that mattered. Or so they thought. But something darker was coming. Within a fortnight, 3 other children fell ill. Strange fevers, rashes shaped like runes, nightmares so vivid they bit through their own tongues while sleeping. When asked what they'd seen, the children all said the same thing. The girl with no shadow, the one who came through the walls and whispered secrets about their mother's sins, who watched from corners and fed them worms that tasted like sugar. The resurrected child, the one brought back, never left her hut, but somehow she was everywhere. The villagers grew restless. Even those who once knelt before the witch now spoke of fire. One man suggested tying her to a horse and dragging her until the bones spoke no more. Another carved symbols into his doorframe, muttering prayers to forgotten gods. They had loved her when she cured their dying, when she bent death backwards. But now they were afraid of what else she might bend. The Kargan sent 2 warriors to investigate, young, brutal men, known more for their blades than their brains. They entered her hut laughing. They didn't laugh long. The next morning, one was found hanging from a tree by his own intestines. The other had clawed out his eyes and was mumbling the word mirror over and over. He didn't stop until his tongue turned black. Still, the Kargan did nothing, cowardice wrapped in fur and jewels. And the witch, she just kept working. People began whispering that she no longer slept, that her fire never died, that her herbs didn't grow in soil, but in the bellies of corpses. They said she'd gone too far, that the bones no longer obeyed, they commanded, and she, the once feared blood woman, had become something worse, a servant to what they couldn't say, but they were about to find out, because on the eve of the spring thaw, every firstborn in the tribe woke up screaming, eyes wide, mouths open, hands clutching invisible throats. And all of them said the same thing. She's coming. And she was. The girl who had once been dead, and whatever now wore her skin, stepped out from the witch's hut just before dawn, barefoot in snow that didn't seem to melt beneath her. Her eyes were blank, not lifeless, not dull, just wrong, like they hadn't been made for seeing what normal humans see. The villagers who glimpsed her that morning swore the frost recoiled from her feet, that the dogs wouldn't bark, and that the sun took longer than usual to rise. Something about her presence bent the day itself. The only sound she made was a humming, high and dissonant, like a lullaby dragged over broken glass. The witch walked behind her, silent, watching, as if even she wasn't sure who or what she'd brought back. No one approached, not even the desperate, especially not the desperate, because every firstborn child was still screaming, and now they'd begun to chant in unison, the same phrase over and over, "Take what's owed, take what's owed." They bled from the nose and bit their own cheeks, but they wouldn't stop. And the witch, she didn't interfere. She began collecting. Salt-bones, bits of hair, old debts, all called in. 3 women were asked for their wedding rings. A hunter was made to surrender, the fingers of his first kill. The mother who had made the original deal, the one who asked for her daughter's return, was seen pacing in circles, clutching her chest, muttering numbers no one could decipher. When someone asked if she regretted it, she didn't even blink. "It's not regret," she whispered. "It's recognition." Because of course she hadn't asked what the price would be, only that she would pay it. Let's go back a bit. You see, Sarmatian witches didn't just heal, they bargained, and their contracts weren't signed in ink. They were stitched into fate with pain, sealed with sacrifice. Every time the blood woman made someone whole, she split something else, something invisible, yes, but vital. That was the secret. Healing wasn't restoration, it was exchange, and the world always demanded balance. Which brings us to the spring thaw. The children stopped screaming, just stopped. Mid-breath, mid-word, even mid-blink, and then they began to smile. That was worse, because these weren't joyous expressions. These were imitations, like a predator mimicking its prey, like something trying very hard to remember how to be human. The witch gathered them, not with force, they came willingly. Each firstborn walked barefoot, eyes glassy, forming a line behind the dead girl, like ants trailing sugar. Some had broken limbs, others dragged bloody mouths or twisted necks. None cried, not one. The tribe watched in frozen horror as the children marched toward the tree line and disappeared. They didn't return that night or the next, and just when it couldn't get more absurd, the dreams began. Every adult in the tribe, man, woman, even the mute boy who hadn't spoken in a decade, began dreaming the same thing. A circle of ash, a child's laughter, the witch standing at the edge, whispering to something massive just beneath the soil. They couldn't move in the dream, could only watch. Sometimes they saw the girl's face peel like fruit. Sometimes they saw their own children, tearing open deer with bare hands, chanting in forgotten dialects. No one slept after that, and those who did, didn't wake up. The Kargan tried to flee, took 10 men, 3 horses, and a bag of gold. None made it past the river. Their bodies were found days later, eyes missing, teeth rearranged, symbols carved into their skin like invitations. The tribe stopped pretending. This was no longer about superstition, this was real, and in the witch's hut, the fire never died. She sat there, eyes sunken, lips cracked, feeding it herbs no one recognized, singing to it, or perhaps listening, because deep in the forest the children were building something. And it was almost finished, deep in the birchwood, where even crows avoided the branches, and moss grew in unsettling shapes. The firstborn children, 37 of them, had constructed something no one could explain. It wasn't a shrine, or a shelter, or anything remotely practical. It was a circle, 12 feet wide, etched into the earth with bone shards, and lined with the soft pale skins of animals no one had hunted. At the centre, a pit, not dug, but opened, as if something below had pushed upward and split the soil from within. And inside that pit, nestled like an egg, was a single, breathing thing, wrapped in roots and whispering. The children never spoke, not even to each other, but they worked with precision. They knew which animal to bleed, which branch to burn, which ancient symbols to scratch into the dirt using their teeth. And the dead girl, if you could still call her that, watched them with a kind of maternal fondness, like a queen tending to her garden of rot. Her eyes gleamed now, black and wet, and her skin no longer reflected light. She didn't blink, she didn't breathe, but she waited. Back in the village, people stopped pretending. This was anything but the unravelling of reality. Women braided their hair with thorns. Men wept into the ground, begging ancestors for mercy. A few brave ones ventured into the woods to bring the children back. They never returned. One man's arm was found nailed to a tree, pointing in the wrong direction. It was still twitching. And the witch, she remained in her hut, grinding things that screamed when crushed. She had stopped speaking days ago, only hummed. The kind of tune that made mirrors crack and milk curdle. When asked if she knew what was happening, she laughed. Just once, it sounded like a blade being sharpened underwater. Then she said, "It's not what's happening, it's who we invited." Let's go back a bit. The Sarmatians didn't have gods the way we think of them. They had forces, nameless, faceless, impossible things. They weren't worshipped, they were appeased, through suffering, through blood, and through balance. The witches, those blood women, weren't conduits of divinity. They were jailers, keeping the old powers locked behind rituals and pain. Every cure they performed chipped away at that prison. Every life saved was a brick loosened, and now the wall had collapsed. The thing in the pit was not a god. It had never been born, never breathed. It had only waited for centuries, millennia. Beneath the roots, beneath the bones, beneath the language of man. And now the children had called it by name, a name no adult could pronounce without choking on their own tongue, a name that made birds fall from the sky, and insects tunnel into their own eyes, and just when it couldn't get more absurd, the sky broke, not literally, but the colour changed, permanently. It turned the hue of spoiled milk, streaked with crimson. Rain began to fall upward. Shadows detached from bodies and began to move. People started hearing their own thoughts whispered back to them. Wrong, twisted versions. A woman slit her husband's throat because the wind told her he was hollow. A boy gouged out his eyes because he could see too much. And still the children danced, around the pit, around the witch, who had finally joined them, arms outstretched, humming louder now. The girl with no shadow stood in the centre, holding a blade carved from her own rib. The thing in the pit pulsed in time with the chanting, no longer whispering, singing, a song older than blood. Then as the moon vanished, the girl raised the rib knife and pointed it not at the creature, but at the village, and she smiled, because the offering wasn't yet complete, and the worst was still to come. When the girl with no shadow pointed that rib-bone blade toward the village, something shifted, not just in the air, but in reality. Birds fell mid-flight, mid-scream, trees shed their bark in one synchronized ripple, and every single flame, in every hearth across the settlement, extinguished with a hiss, as if the very concept of fire had been revoked. People didn't scream, not at first. They stood stunned, blinking like animals before a storm they couldn't outrun. Then came the tremor, not in the ground, but in their bones. Hips clicked, teeth shivered, eyes watered without emotion. It felt like grief, but ancient and unfamiliar, the kind of sorrow that predated language. And then the walking began. From the pit emerged figures, limbs too long, necks bent wrong, joints rotating the way they shouldn't. They wore no clothes. Their skin was the colour of bruised stone, and slick with something that steamed even in the cold. They had no faces, just smooth pulsing indentations where features should be, but each one carried a mark, something carved deep into the flesh of their chests, a different rune for each child who had vanished. Living debts, made flesh. They didn't run, they didn't scream. They walked, calm, precise, as if pulled by threads tied to the ribs of every villager. The people tried to hide, bolted doors, whispered old prayers, some smeared ash across their foreheads, hoping the gods remembered their names. But this wasn't punishment. It was collection. The children had summoned these things, or maybe become them. The difference didn't matter. The witch walked ahead of them, her face blank, eyes milky, chanting in a language that bent the ears. Her voice seemed to echo inward, as if the sound collapsed space instead of filling it. She passed a mother clutching her child, and the child reached for her. "Mama," it said, but the word came out in two voices, one high and human, the other low and cracked, like wind moving through dead reeds. The mother screamed, the child smiled, and then they both dissolved, not exploded, not burned, dissolved, into smoke, into dust, into memory. But that wasn't even the worst part, because deep inside the pit, the thing began to rise. It wasn't fast, it didn't need to be. The world waited for it. Even the stars seemed to pause. The creature was not massive in size, it was massive in implication. Looking at it felt like being buried alive in silence. It had no form, just suggestion, a silhouette constantly shifting, a mother's shape, a predator's grin, a child's open arms. It was every fear ever whispered in the dark by those who hoped they weren't heard. And now it was listening. The girl with no shadow approached it. She held out the rib blade like a gift, and it accepted, not by taking it, but by becoming it. The blade melted into the creature, and for a moment the girl smiled. Not cruelly, not madly, but with peace, like someone who'd fulfilled their purpose. Then, without warning, her body collapsed inward, bone folding into marrow, skin crinkling like old parchment, and she was gone. And just when it couldn't get more absurd, the villagers heard their names. Not shouted, not called, spoken by the creature. each name twisted in ways it shouldn't have been, drawn out, reversed, broken into syllables that made the spine ache, and those who heard their names dropped to their knees, not in prayer, in obedience, because they remembered. They remembered the deals they'd made, the herbs they'd begged for, the pain they'd traded for life. And now the debt collector had arrived, with interest. The sky bled static, the ground throbbed, and the fire, the one inside the witch's hut that had never gone out, it turned blue, because the second ritual had begun, and this one wasn't for healing. The blue fire inside the witch's hut pulsed with a rhythm that didn't match time. It flared in sudden bursts, like inhalations of something enormous trying to remember how lungs worked. The flames hissed through the gaps in the walls, whispering names and numbers that didn't belong to anyone alive. The smoke didn't rise, it sank, crawled along the dirt like a wounded animal, slipping beneath door frames and under skin. It found you, even in your prayers, especially there, and when it touched you, it knew exactly where to burn. The villagers who hadn't yet fled or crumbled gathered near the centre of the settlement, faces caked in soot and panic. No more elders, no more leaders, just survival instincts stretched thin. Some still clutched weapons, as if steel could negotiate with the supernatural. Others held loved ones, muttering things they wished they'd said earlier. A few stared into the woods, mesmerised by the flicker of unnatural light and the faint, rhythmic thudding that seemed to be coming from beneath the earth itself. They didn't know what it was, but they all felt it. Meanwhile, the creature, the thing from the pit, continued to shift, its body a storm of silhouettes and suggestion. It didn't move closer, it didn't have to. Everything else was moving toward it. Even the trees, slowly bending, even the stars above, subtly dragging toward its shape, like iron to a magnet. This wasn't an invasion, it was an awakening, and the Sarmatian witch, the blood woman, was both priestess and prisoner. Let's go back a bit. Sarmatian witches weren't born, they were chosen, not by gods, by gaps, places where reality had frayed, where logic failed and the world thinned just enough for something else to reach through. These women were keys, living bridges between what is and what should never be. That's why they carried bones, not as charms, but as locks. That's why they brewed suffering, not for magic, but for containment. They weren't healers, they were wardens, and she had failed, or worse, succeeded at the wrong thing. The second ritual wasn't hers alone. As the fire turned blue, others responded, from distant forests, from tundras, from beneath rivers. Other witches, other blood women, some came on foot, their bodies crumbling with every step. Others arrived on wind as screams, and a few simply appeared, forming out of shadow and frost. They formed a circle around the pit, around the creature, around the trembling remnants of the village. 30 of them, one for each child, one for each sin, and just when it couldn't get more absurd, they began to sing. Not a melody, a vibration, a low, grinding resonance that made nails peel and teeth ache. It wasn't music, it was warning, a call to whatever was left in the soil, telling it to stay buried, but it was too late. The creature pulsed once and the earth cracked open like ribs. From the fissures poured voices, thousands, all at once, some sobbing, some laughing, most screaming, the voices of everyone the witches had ever saved, everyone whose pain had been bartered. They were not grateful, they were angry, torn from death without consent, forced to live, now finally given a way back. They swarmed the air like locusts made of memory and hate. People fell, not because they were attacked, but because they remembered. Every selfish plea, every whispered bargain, every time they said, "Take anyone but me." And the debt keeper remembered too. The witch knelt. She didn't pray, she simply watched. And in her palm, a final bone, not a relic, a child's finger, small fresh. She broke it in half. The blue flame turned white. The creature stilled, and the witches raised their arms one last time. Because this wasn't about stopping it anymore. It was about bargaining for what little future might still crawl from the wreckage, and so they did. The circle of witches, 30 voices, grinding the air into something coarse and cruel, lifted their arms and bled. Not from cuts, not from wounds, but from their eyes. Thick, black tears that hissed as they hit the snow, melting it into perfect circles that steamed like boiling oil. This was their currency now. Memory, vision, the essence of what they had seen and could no longer unsee. It spilled freely, pooling between their bare feet, feeding something beneath the soil. The creature watched, and it understood. Not through eyes, not through thought, through hunger. This was an offering it recognized, not flesh, not fire, but finality, and the Sarmatian witch at the centre of the storm raised her hands last. Her palms were split from decades of mixing grief into medicine, her veins blackened from herbs that shouldn't have grown. She looked up, not at the creature, but beyond it, past it, into something vaster, and then she spoke. One word, old, too old, a word no longer spoken aloud by those who knew what it meant, a name really, not hers. Its, the creature's original designation, the sound of its binding, the syllable that once chained it beneath the world. And just when it couldn't get more absurd, the creature flinched. A ripple shot through its form, warping its shape like hot wax under breath. It didn't scream, it didn't roar, it trembled. And in that instant, the villagers felt something they hadn't felt in days. Hope, twisted, tentative, but real. A flicker of resistance in a story drowning in surrender. But hope is dangerous, because the creature recovered. Slowly, deliberately, it reassembled itself with a kind of insulted grace, as if ashamed that it had ever faltered. Then it spoke back. Not with a voice, with presence. Every witch dropped to her knees, not in reverence, in agony. Their blood boiled inside them. The snow beneath their feet turned black. One by one, their spines arched backward, mouths agape, and from each came a thread of smoke that twisted toward the sky and vanished. Their memories, their power, their price. The Sarmatian witch stood alone now, the last of the 30, still upright, still bleeding from the eyes, but inside her, something else. Not fear, not even defiance, resignation. She had always known this moment would come. It was why she learned to kill with herbs and resurrect with screams. Why she never wept when her teacher died, or her ribs cracked from sleep visions. She was not chosen by fate. She chose this, and now it was time to finish it. She reached into her cloak and pulled out a bundle wrapped in rawhide. The last secret. The unspoken remedy. Not a charm, not a poison, a piece of herself, cut long ago and preserved in silence. Her own tooth, broken during her first binding ritual, tainted with her blood, her fear, her love. She placed it at the edge of the pit and whispered something even the earth didn't want to hear. Then she turned her back and walked into the fire, not toward the creature, not toward the villagers, into the hut, into the blue-white inferno she'd kept alive since the first scream, and the hut collapsed, not from heat, from release. The very space around it folded inward, like a dying breath, and vanished with a sound like cloth tearing underwater. And in that silence, the creature paused. Its tendrils twitched, its silhouette flickered, and for the first time since it had emerged, it hesitated, because the witch hadn't fought it. She had fed it something else, something it didn't recognize, sacrifice without plea, pain without demand, and that changed everything, because the creature, this ageless thing, dredged from beneath centuries of silence and secrecy, understood transactions. It fed on desperation, on bartered agony, on choices made in the shadow of death. But what the witch had given it was something foreign, a gift without a request, a surrender without strings, and the creature, for all its shape-shifting horror and mind-curdling presence, paused. It rippled, it dimmed, as if confusion had entered its being like a splinter. The villagers didn't notice at first. They were too busy screaming, too busy shielding their children, too busy clutching at cracked earth and praying to gods who'd abandoned them long before the first child vanished. But the wind noticed. It stopped. The smoke that had been choking the sky began to coil downward, swirling into the pit like water down a drain. The fire, that impossible, eldritch blue-white inferno, didn't flicker or fade. It froze, became perfectly still, a sculpture of light in a moment that defied time. And in that stillness, something broke. Not a sound, a tension, a rule. One of those invisible ancient laws written in the marrow of the world. The kind that no human speaks aloud, but every shadow obeys. The creature twitched again. Its form began to melt, not physically, but conceptually. One moment, it was the silhouette of a grieving mother. The next, a wounded animal. Then a clawed infant. Then just a smear of colour you could see only when you weren't looking directly at it. It began to flicker, as if unsure whether it belonged in this place anymore. But that wasn't even the worst part, because while the creature unravelled, the villagers began to change too. Not into beasts, not into monsters, but into truths. You see, the Sarmatian witch's final act hadn't just targeted the thing in the pit. It had echoed outward, cracking the false veneers everyone wore like frostbitten skin. The liar confessed, the murderer remembered. The adulterer bled from their wedding ring. Every bargain, every buried secret, every whispered betrayal came clawing to the surface, and those who had fed on silence now choked on honesty. One man screamed until his own tongue split. He had drowned his daughter 3 winters ago during a famine, and claimed she'd wandered into the ice. Now her name spilled from his mouth in a loop, stitched with regret and blood. Another woman fell to her knees and began digging into the dirt with her bare hands, whispering that her husband was buried there. No one had even known he was dead. This wasn't confession. This was reckoning, and just when it couldn't get more absurd, the children returned. Not from the forest, not from the pit, from nowhere. They were simply there again, standing where they had once vanished, eyes wide, clothes torn, but breathing. But they weren't the same. They didn't cry, didn't speak. Each of them carried something in their hand. A fragment, a bone, a coin, a shard of glass, a piece of broken tooth. They placed these tokens in a circle at the centre of the village where the witch's hut had once stood. Then they sat, cross-legged, waiting, and in that circle a new fire began to form. Not blue, not white, not even hot. It glowed with memory, with cost, with the weight of things paid in full. The creature, what was left of it, pulsed once more, but it did not grow, it did not strike. It nodded, or the closest thing its warped presence could manage. Then it collapsed inward, folding into itself like paper in flame, vanishing with a sound that wasn't a roar or a scream, but a sigh of exhaustion, or maybe release, and the silence that followed was unbearable, because the reckoning might be over. But the understanding had just begun. When the creature vanished, folded into non-existence, like an unwanted thought, the village didn't erupt in cheers. There were no gasps of relief, no embraces, no weeping for joy. Instead, there was stillness, absolute and inescapable, as if even the concept of celebration had been stolen away, devoured alongside the horror. The children still sat in their circle, motionless, each guarding their fragment, like it was the last piece of something sacred and broken. The villagers didn't dare approach, not out of fear, but out of guilt, because understanding does that to people. It doesn't just reveal the monster, it makes you realise you built it. They began to walk, quietly, toward the centre, slowly, step by step like pilgrims toward some shameful shrine. And in the ashes of the hut, where blue-white flame had once licked the bones of a woman who never asked for thanks, there was now something else, a tree, sprouting, not sapling small, but nearly full-grown, twisted, dark, with bark that shimmered like old blood in moonlight. No one had planted it, no one had seen it grow, it simply was. At its base sat the fragments the children had placed, bone, coin, glass, tooth, tokens of memory, of debt, of identity, and just when it couldn't get more absurd, the tree spoke, not in words, not aloud, it pulsed in their heads, each villager receiving something different. Some saw their worst moment relived. Others heard voices they thought long dead. One woman fainted at the smell of her firstborn's hair, something she hadn't remembered in decades. Another man collapsed to his knees at the sound of his father's weeping. The tree was truth, condensed, rooted in sacrifice, blooming from sorrow, a monument to the price of survival. And the children, they stood up, still wordless, still eerily calm, but now moving. One by one they approached their parents, or what remained of them. Some parents flinched, some reached, others simply cried. But the children didn't return to their homes. They led, they walked, slow and solemn, toward the tree, and the villagers followed, because what else could they do? What else was there to do? They had begged for life, been given it, then shown what it cost. Let's go back a bit. The Sarmatians never truly believed in justice, not in the way we think of it. Courts, laws, balance. They believed in exchange. You want rain? Give a goat. You want healing? Give blood. You want a child? Give a part of yourself you'll never get back. They didn't fear suffering. They feared imbalance. And for too long, the village had demanded without giving, begged without bleeding. They had used the witch like a well, never wondering where the water came from, until it ran dry, or worse, until it overflowed. The children reached the tree, and each one pressed their forehead against its trunk. Some cried, not loudly, not from pain, but from something deeper. Recognition, maybe, the kind that makes your stomach drop and your soul itch. Then they turned and sat, in a new circle, around the base, forming a ring of guardians around this living monument to horror, mercy, and memory. And then, finally, the first word. A small boy, barely 6, voice cracking, she paid. And suddenly they all understood. The witch hadn't been consumed. She'd become part of the binding. The sacrifice wasn't death, it was integration. She was now the tree, the memory, the root and the whisper. She had traded her body not for revenge, not even for victory, but for balance, and that's when the snow began to fall again. Gentle, quiet, not like ash this time, like peace trying to grow in the soil of grief. That's what the snow felt like, each flake a tiny forgiveness, landing gently on skin that didn't deserve it. The villagers stood around the tree, around the children, around the fragments of their old lives, and didn't speak. Not because there was nothing to say, but because anything they could say would feel like a betrayal of what had happened. Words were too small now, too clean. Language had always been a poor tool for truth. That was the witch's real genius. She had never relied on it. She spoke in wounds and cures, in rituals and refusals, and now she was the language. The tree creaked in the windless morning, bark splitting slightly to reveal veins of light, as if the earth itself had decided to bleed a little in her honour. The children remained seated around it, their presence no longer uncanny, but necessary. Not guardians, not prophets, witnesses. They didn't smile, they didn't play, but they were alive, and in a place that had danced so close to the edge of annihilation, that alone was a miracle. A few of the braver villagers approached, hands shaking, knees buckling beneath old guilt. One woman dropped to her knees and kissed her daughter's feet. Another man tried to offer his hunting knife, as if sacrifice was still possible. The children accepted nothing. They only nodded, and that was when the markings began. Faint at first, barely visible, like bruises under the snow-pale skin, but slowly the runes etched themselves into the children's arms and necks, glowing faintly like embers under ash, not all the same, each one unique, tailored. It was as though the tree, she, was writing something onto them, a story, a spell, a warning, no one knew, but the markings pulsed in rhythm with the wind, and the villagers backed away instinctively, because now came the task. Let's go back a bit. Sarmatian stories didn't end. They didn't wrap themselves in bows or teach lessons. They continued, through song, through scar, through the shapes left behind when a person vanished. The witch knew this. That's why she left no heir, because she had never needed one. She left a pattern, and patterns repeat. The children were not her replacements. They were the next line of the incantation, living punctuation marks. In a sentence too long to read all at once, the villagers built shelters near the tree, not homes, not yet, just space to breathe, to sit, to listen. They didn't speak of returning to normal, because what had been normal before? Bargaining with a woman they feared but relied on, letting her carry the burden of their fear, their desperation, their rot? No, there would be no return, only a continuation. And in that decision, something shifted. They started remembering, not just the horror, the lives that came before it, the kindnesses they'd neglected, the children's laughter, the stories told by firelight, the quiet nights when nothing screamed. They began to share food again, not as payment, but as gesture, not to the tree, to each other, rebuilding, not from rubble, but from truth. And just when it couldn't get more absurd, the snow stopped. Mid-flake, as if someone had exhaled and paused. In that breathless moment, every villager felt the same thing. Warmth, not from the sun, it was still hidden, but from beneath their feet, from the earth itself, as if the tree, the witch, the balance was letting them know. You may continue. One child stood, a girl no older than 8, with a scar over her eye, shaped like a crescent moon. She walked to the tree and placed her hand on its trunk. The light inside pulsed in response. She turned to the village and said 4 words. Now it's our turn. And just like that, the work began. Not in panic, in reverence, because they finally understood the price, and for once they were willing to pay it themselves. Not because anyone demanded it, not because some arcane threat loomed over them this time, but because they knew, deep in their marrow, the balance must be kept, and this time it would be by their own hands. Not passed off, not begged for, not pawned onto some solitary sacrificial figure cloaked in herbs and half-truths. The villagers began dividing their tasks not by role or status, but by what they owed. The ones who had made the deepest bargains took the most painful jobs, scraping ash from burned beams, digging graves that no one had asked for, but everyone expected, collecting bones from the forest where echoes still clung to the bark like frost. They didn't speak much, but when they did, they spoke clearly. And it was the children who led them, each marked with runes that pulsed dimly now, like coals waiting to be stoked. Not just decoration, these were maps, guides to understanding how to live after living had betrayed them. The crescent-eyed girl was the first to draw the village's new boundaries, not walls to keep things out, but lines of intention, a perimeter of purpose. They laid stones at the edge of these lines, etched with the names of the forgotten, the lost children, the vanished witches, even the Colgan who had fled like a coward, because remembering everything was part of the price too. But something darker was coming. It began with the animals, first the birds. They returned in strange formations, flying not in V-shapes but in spirals, diving to the tree and then scattering like broken thoughts. Then the wolves, not aggressive, not rabid, but present, watching, lurking just beyond the perimeter. One night, a pack of them sat silently in the clearing, unmoving, eyes reflecting the tree's faint light. When approached, they didn't run. They simply stared and then they left. But they took something with them, a man, voluntarily. He had been one of the first to curse the witch, the loudest to call her unnatural. Now he walked barefoot into the snow and sat before the wolves. They surrounded him. He whispered something. No one knows what, and then they vanished into the forest. He was never seen again. The next day, a new branch grew on the tree. Black, twisted, pointing west. No one questioned it, because this was the new order of things. Give and be given to, suffer and see what grows. The children began carving symbols into wood, hanging them from their belts. The villagers started to do the same. Each symbol was different, personalised, not charms, confessions. Worn openly, as if to say, here is who I am, and here is what I've done. Secrets were currency now, and honesty the only language that still worked. And just when it couldn't get more absurd, the tree bled, not sap blood, thick and dark, running down its bark in slow rivulets. The children didn't panic. They gathered it, not with buckets but with hands. They painted their faces with it, then painted the doors of the village homes. No one told them to, no one stopped them, and when they were done, the tree stopped bleeding, its bark hardened, its glow deepened. That night, no one dreamed. Not a single villager reported a single image. Sleep came like death, total, black, and silent. When they woke, every child had new runes, and the village knew, without anyone saying a word, that the next phase had begun. Because memory is not a one-time payment. It is a cycle, and balance doesn't just demand cost, it demands continuity. And now that the children had borne their runes and the tree had bled its grief into the snow-soaked earth, the village understood. They weren't living in the aftermath. They were living in the middle of an inheritance. What had been conjured, what had been paid, what had been awakened. It didn't end with a creature swallowed by its own name. That was only the breach. The reordering had begun, and no one could pretend to be innocent anymore. The blood on the tree was dry by morning, but its stain remained, not just on bark, but on everything. Snow refused to fall near it now. Wind curved around it. Sound dulled in its shadow. It had become a presence, not a plant. And the children changed again. They spoke now. Not often, not clearly, but when they did, the words came in fragments that didn't always belong to them. He remembers the fire. She's watching the roots. It needs a mouth. Unnerving, but never random. Each phrase planted itself in the minds of the adults, like seeds of recognition, like they were being taught to understand a language they already knew, but had forgotten out of convenience. The runes on their skin darkened, and just when it couldn't get more absurd, the sky cracked, not physically, not with thunder. But conceptually, it was evening, and the sunset just stopped, hung in place like paint refusing to dry. Then the light bent, colours running sideways instead of fading. For one long minute, no one could tell where the sun was, just that everything felt tilted. Time hiccuped. A woman spilled water, and it froze mid-pour. A man fell to his knees, weeping. Not because of pain, but because he saw the moon blink. Not rise, blink, then just as suddenly it all snapped back. But the children had new marks, circles, small, perfect, burned into their palms. The villagers gathered again, quietly. No one rang bells or called a meeting. They just knew to come, instinct, like hunger or shame. They stood in a ring around the children, now sitting beneath the tree in meditative silence, palms out. The marks in their hands began to glow, dim at first, then brighter, until they cast shadows of everyone present. And then they asked. The children looked up, all at once, and asked, "Will you listen this time?" The words didn't echo, they embedded. Let's go back a bit. The last time the village had been asked to listen, it had been from the witch, and they hadn't. They had tolerated, feared, relied, but they hadn't listened. And now that mistake was inscribed in every breath of the forest, in every crack in the sky. This was their second chance, not to undo the damage, but to absorb it. One by one, the villagers sat. They didn't answer with words. They answered with posture, with presence, with stillness. And the children began to speak. Each one told a story, but not their own. These were not the stories of what happened in the woods, or what the creature had whispered. These were older, stories buried in the bones of the settlement, of ancient hunts, of betrayals long past, of ancestors who had once made similar bargains, and the generations who had pretended otherwise. The children were conduits now, and the villagers, witnesses, and just when you thought it couldn't go deeper, the ground beneath the tree breathed, a slow inhale. Not air, memory. The children stood, turned outward, and whispered, "Now you carry it." And so they did. Not because they wanted to, but because denial was no longer a privilege anyone could afford. From the moment the children whispered, "Now you carry it," something shifted. Not in the ground, not in the sky, but in the villagers themselves. Their bodies didn't change. Their clothes didn't turn to ash or scale or feather, but every single one of them felt heavier, as if they were now hauling the weight of truths that had no name, only shape. Some fell to their knees without knowing why. Others sobbed. Not from sorrow, but from recognition. This was their burden now, and there would be no witch to absorb the next disaster. no scapegoat to bury beneath curses and need. They would walk forward with full awareness that they were the keepers now, of balance, of consequence, of the tree. The runes on the children's skin pulsed once, then dulled, like a ritual had completed itself or begun a new phase, and just when it couldn't get more absurd, the tree grew again. Not in the way trees do, not leaf by leaf, season by season, it expanded downward. Its roots exploded through the earth with the sound of bones snapping in rhythm. The ground cracked and trembled, but didn't collapse. Instead, it opened, a jagged spiral circling the tree, revealing a descent of stone steps that hadn't been there before, or maybe had always been there, hidden until now. Cold mist rolled up from below, dense and sharp with the scent of burnt herbs and old metal. The villagers stared at it like it might devour them, or worse, invite them. The children didn't move, but one woman did. She was old, older than anyone remembered her being. She stepped forward slowly, her joints creaking like dry wood. Her name was Tarsa, and she had once been the midwife, back before the witch had taken over all things, birth and death. Tarsa had delivered half the village, then been forgotten, slowly, like a candle snuffed by stronger flame. But now, as she looked into that spiral of mist and memory, she remembered herself, and she descended, not hurried, not afraid, just resolved. The steps swallowed her, and a moment later, the tree shivered. Let's go back a bit. There were always layers. In every Sarmatian rite, in every whispered cure or sacrifice, there were levels of meaning, one for the body, one for the spirit, and one that only the ground remembered. The spiral stair was the last level. Not punishment, not escape, understanding, a descent into the marrow of the truth. Tarsa had gone to speak with what lay beneath the witch's memory, beneath the creature's aftermath. To ask questions no one else had the right to form, or the courage to hear answered. Above, the villagers sat again, this time not in fear, in ritual. They began to mimic the children. Palms open, faces calm, runes freshly carved into wood. Bone, even skin. They sang, not words, tones, echoes of what they'd heard in the witch's hum, what they remembered from nights. She treated their dying, discordant, trembling, but honest. It wasn't beautiful, but it was true. And just when you thought the pit below had swallowed its last secret, Tarsa returned, but she wasn't alone. Behind her rose a shadow, not a creature, a shape, human, tall, silent, featureless, cloaked in what looked like mist made solid. It didn't threaten, it didn't speak, it simply walked to the tree and placed a hand on its trunk. The bark did not resist, it opened slightly, allowing the shadow's palm to sink in like a blade through soft earth, and the tree pulsed once more. The roots glowed faintly. The mist receded. Tarsa turned to the villagers and spoke 4 words. It has been answered. No one knew what the question had been, but they all felt it. Something ancient had accepted the terms. And now the binding was mutual. That was the difference. The shift no one had words for, but all could feel. Before, everything had been one way, fear moving in a single direction, desperation thrown into a pit and stitched into the skin of one woman. But now the balance cut both ways. The presence that had emerged with Tarsa, tall, cloaked in whispering mist, was not a god, not a demon, not even a spirit, in the way old stories define them. It was a witness, an entity with no name. Because names implied control, this thing could not be named, only acknowledged. And it had placed its hand on the tree like one signs a contract in blood. The villagers watched, breath caught in the hollow just below the ribs, that place where memory sours into instinct. The tree did not shiver, it didn't blaze, it simply accepted. Its bark rippled, absorbing the imprint of the shadow hand, sealing the pact not with fire, but with presence, a moment so dense with meaning, it weighed more than silence, more than sound. And then the figure stepped back and vanished. Not into mist, into history, like it had always been part of this place. And just when it couldn't get more absurd, the tree spoke again. This time, through the children, one by one, their eyes rolled white, their mouths opened wide, not in terror but in transmission. They spoke not in their voices, but in hers. The witches, still sharp, still dry, still laced with that bitter herb tongue that made the air feel thicker when it passed, but not angry, not vengeful, instructional. Do not forget this, the children said in unison. Do not lie about it. Do not twist it into comfort. Let it stay jagged in your memory. Let it cut when you retell it. Each line hit like bone against stone, solid, final, unignorable. The villagers listened, some crying, some nodding, some clutching the tokens around their necks, like the only thing tethering them to the present. Let's go back a bit. Sarmatian oral tradition wasn't about accuracy, it was about integrity. You didn't retell stories to make people feel safe, you told them to make people remember. That was how curses were avoided, not with charms, with truth that stung. The witch had known this. She had buried her story, deep in ritual, in pain, in layered meanings no outsider would ever untangle. And now that story had been made flesh through the tree, the runes, the children, the spiral. The village wasn't just a place anymore. It was a wound. And a wound, when healed correctly, leaves a scar. The villagers understood. From now on, they were no longer farmers, hunters, traders. They were keepers. Not of a place, of a pattern. And the pattern required retelling, reliving, renewing. Every year, the children would lead the reenactment. Not a play, not a celebration, a remembering. The tree would bleed again, the spiral would open, someone would descend, and the questions would be asked once more. Because balance is never permanent. It's a conversation between fear and duty, and just when you thought the world might return to stillness. The wind returned, but it blew backward. Leaves lifted off the ground and floated upward. Ashes reassembled in the fire pit. A broken tool mended itself without hands. Time didn't reverse, but it remembered. The land was responding, not to magic, but to honesty, to an ecosystem of grief that had finally admitted it was broken. And above the tree, for the first time in living memory, lightning, not a storm, just one bolt striking the peak of the tree, silent. Final, as if the sky had signed its own part of the pact. Balance, it turns out, had witnesses in all directions. The tree with its lightning-scored crown, the spiral that breathed memory into stone, the villagers who had once begged for deliverance and now bore the burden of preservation. Each was now part of a network of remembrance. The lightning had not burned the tree. It had etched a new rune into its highest branch, one none of the children could translate. Not yet, but all of them felt it. A message not in words but in weight. The storm above had listened, and now it had spoken. The sky, once distant and uncaring, had entered the contract. And the next day, the stars refused to follow their old paths. They appeared at dusk like they always did, but they were wrong, reconfigured. Not scattered across the heavens like seeds, but aligned, 12 of them, sharp and white, forming a perfect ring above the tree. The rest flickered in and out, like they were unsure if they belonged anymore. The villagers stared, breath caught in their throats, because something in their bones whispered the obvious. These were marks. The sky was telling its own version of the story, and just when it couldn't get more absurd, one of the stars fell. Not with fire, with silence. It landed not in the forest, not in the snow, but in the centre of the spiral, just beyond the last visible step. A soundless silver seed, pulsing faintly, like it had a heartbeat. The villagers gathered, again without command. Drawn, and the children formed a ring around it, just as they had done with the fragments in the earliest days. The seed shimmered. It did not grow. It waited. Let's go back a bit. The Sarmatians believed stars were not distant suns, but eyes, not metaphorically, literally, witnesses of old pacts, sentinels that only blinked when truth was broken. The falling of a star was not omen. It was response, a cosmic nod, and this one had come not to judge, but to join, to embed itself in the memory they had built. The children placed their palms above the seed without touching it. The runes on their hands flared once, then dimmed to black. The runes were done. The children looked older, not physically, but heavier, and then the seed opened, not like a flower, like a wound, a slit of silver light that unfolded upward, casting long shadows that bent the wrong way. From inside a sound emerged, a vibration. It didn't echo, it nested, it found space inside rib cages, and curled there, making breath feel like prophecy. The villagers didn't understand it, not with language, but they knew what it meant. The past was done recording. Now the future had begun listening. From this moment forward, the village was no longer just a site of survival. It was a threshold. People would come, not to gawk, not to worship, but to learn, because word would spread. Through merchants who woke from dreams they couldn't explain. Through birds whose flight paths now curved oddly around this place. Through whispers in other lands about a tree that hums in a dead tongue, and children who speak in chords instead of speech. And just when you thought the earth had finished revealing its secrets, the roots moved, only slightly, but enough to crack the stone beneath the spiral, and from within, light, liquid and thick like gold that had bled through time. It didn't scorch, it illuminated. A chamber, once hidden, now revealed itself. Walls covered in carvings, older than alphabet, older than breath. Scenes of other villages, other witches, other reckonings. This had happened before. It would happen again, because balance, while sacred, is never static, and the tree had grown not from soil, but from cycle. That was the lesson the chamber whispered through its glowing walls. Every image, every line, carved deep into the stone, screamed the same message. This was not the first village, not the first tree, not the first creature, pulled from the ragged edges of desperation. There had been others, so many others, their memories etched not into books, not into song, but into the bones of the earth itself. Some villages had endured, some had not. The deciding factor had never been strength or magic or cleverness. It had been willingness. The courage to look at horror, hold it close, and remember it properly. Not sanitize it, not bury it in ceremony, but wear it like a second skin. The villagers explored the chamber slowly, torchless. The light from the walls sufficed. It hummed at them, not in a melody, but in frequency. It tingled in the teeth, made old injuries ache again, not painful, just honest. There was no dust, no rot. Time had not passed here in any way the villagers understood, and at the chamber's centre stood another tree, dead, petrified. Stone roots frozen in a desperate reach for something long since gone, and around it dozens of small stone figures. Children, frozen mid-scream, mid-step, mid-ritual. They had failed. That much was clear. This was a previous attempt at balance, and it had collapsed under its own cowardice, and just when it couldn't get more absurd. The stone tree spoke, not aloud, in memory. Every villager in the chamber blinked, and found themselves elsewhere, in dreams that weren't theirs, in choices they hadn't made, watching another village's final day unfold with brutal clarity. A child offering herself, a mother turning away, a father lying to the roots, and then the collapse, fire, ash, a creature not unlike the one they had seen, but this one unbound, roaming, consuming, not to punish, to correct. The village had tried to cheat the cycle, tried to shortcut the offering, and the cost had multiplied. The villagers awoke weeping, not for themselves, for the others, because the cycle wasn't cruel, it was precise, and precision is unforgiving. Let's go back a bit. Sarmatian myths taught that time was not a line, but a net. Events echoed in all directions. The same way a mistake in one thread can fray the entire weave, a village that forgets its history doesn't just doom itself, it unravels others. This place, this tree, this balance, none of it existed in isolation. Every choice here rippled, every silence spoken too late became thunder elsewhere. That's why the children said nothing now. They were listening, not to the tree anymore, to the net, and they began to draw, in ash, in mud, in blood, symbols no one recognized, lines that spiraled in on themselves, then split into sharp, jarring angles, not language, instructions. The villagers copied them, one by one, onto walls, stones, skin, even into their fields. They weren't told what the symbols meant, only that they had to be preserved, like pressure points on the world's body, because the next storm wouldn't ask permission, and just when they started to think they understood the stakes, a child collapsed, no wound, no cry, just sudden stillness. The crescent-eyed girl, her hand still smudged with ash, and when the villagers rushed to her, she gasped a single word before going limp. East. No one moved, because no one wanted to understand what that meant, but they did. The cycle had turned again, and this time it wasn't coming to them. It was moving through them, not toward, not away, through, like they had become the conduit, the vessel, the echo chamber, for something ancient enough to forget mercy, but precise enough to remember intent. The crescent-eyed girl lay still, her breath shallow, her body warm but inert. The other children did not panic. They knelt beside her, drew new runes in the snow around her head, and whispered in tones that didn't match their ages, tones that had dust in them. Distance, the kind of vibration only caves and bones understand. One of them leaned in and whispered, "She's not gone, she's travelling." And just when it couldn't get more absurd, the ground east of the village cracked, not violently, not like an earthquake, but like skin splitting under pressure. A fissure opened, maybe 20 paces wide, running straight toward the distant horizon, toward the next place. The villagers stared, unsure whether to fear it or follow it. They didn't speak. The silence was sacred now, and every word felt like a pebble tossed into an unknown abyss. Let's go back a bit. The east in Sarmatian law wasn't just a direction, it was an orientation of consequence. East meant beginnings. Yes, but also reckonings, the place where light emerged and lies went to die. If something was heading east, it wasn't escaping, it was delivering, carrying the memory of what happened into another phase, another village, another broken place that had forgotten how to kneel without asking for reward. The children began to walk, not all of them, just 7, the ones marked with spirals instead of runes. Their faces were unreadable, their bodies small, but they moved like weather systems, slow, inevitable, uninterested in being stopped. They each carried an object, a token, drawn from the tree's bloodline, a shard of bark, a stone from the chamber, a feather stained with old blood, a bone rune, a piece of the silver seed, a bottle of the earth's glowing sap, and the last carried nothing, just silence. The most volatile of all, they did not look back, because they didn't need to. The village had changed. It wasn't a place anymore. It was a portal, and just when the villagers thought they might weep from the sheer immensity of what they were becoming, the crescent-eyed girl spoke, not with her mouth, with the air. Her body still lay on the ground, still unmoving, but her presence rose like mist from warm water, coiling above the tree in a shape that almost looked like her, if her skin were light and her voice were wind. She looked east, and then she laughed. Not joy, recognition, as if she had seen what waited beyond the horizon and found it familiar. She whispered, "They're not ready," and the tree groaned. Deep-rooted, final. Let's go back a bit. The first witches were not born, they were sculpted, not by magic, but by trauma refined into clarity. Every village that failed produced something, sometimes rage, sometimes ruin, but occasionally it produced memory strong enough to walk. That's what these children had become. Not prophets, not martyrs, libraries, and libraries don't beg to be read, they just exist, waiting for the next fool or hero to open the wrong door. And so, the 7 walked, the villagers stood, the tree pulsed once, and from the crack in the earth, wind rose, not wild but intentional, a delivery system for whatever the next lesson would be. Because balance doesn't end with justice, it ends with replication. What had been born here, through death, through fear, through sacrifice and surrender, was not some tidy conclusion, not a final harmony sung into the woods to lull the gods back to sleep. No, it was a formula, a spell written in blood and bone and bark, designed not to end but to repeat. The villagers knew it. The children knew it. The wind, whipping now eastward with growing urgency, seemed to carry that knowing, as if the land itself was eager to correct, to rebalance, to retell. And so the 7 children walked east, shadows stretched long behind them. They passed through the fissure like ghosts in reverse, too real to be ignored. Their bodies small, but every step sounded like thunder to the villagers who remained. Not that the children looked back, they didn't need to. What was behind them was now sealed, encased in symbol, in story, in scar. The crescent-eyed girl's voice still hovered in the village. "They're not ready," it repeated. A whisper, a warning, a dare. No one knew, but everyone heard it. Let's go back a bit. Among the oldest Sarmatian tales, there was one almost never told aloud. The whisper of the 12th mouth. Not because it was forbidden, but because it was futile. It was said that in each age, 12 voices were chosen to carry a truth too sharp for language. 11 would speak it. 1 would embody it. That was the 12th. The mouth that didn't open because it was the message. The girl was that 12th mouth now. Her voice would travel, not just on wind, but through memory, through the choices the next village made or failed to make. And just when it couldn't get more absurd, the tree began to wither, not from disease, from release. Its bark greyed, its pulse faded, the runes dulled like old wounds, finally scarring over. Not disappearing, settling. It no longer needed to remain awake. The tree had done its part. It had absorbed, transmitted, bound. Now it rested. A new form of sacred, dormant, like an elder who has spoken the last necessary word and stepped back to let the future bloom or burn without interference. The villagers did not cry, they tended to it. They brought offerings, not in fear this time, but in gratitude. They buried the tools they once used to demand miracles, laid down old amulets, burned the last of their bitter rootstock, the herbs they had always stockpiled for emergencies. There would be no more begging, no more bargaining. The world would be what they shaped, not what they manipulated, and they began to write, not with ink, with pattern, across their homes, their clothes, their fields. They etched the story. Not as decoration, as infrastructure. Children learned to draw runes before letters. Elders trained to hum the old frequencies before they spoke each day. Even the animals sensed it. Wolves did not flee anymore. Birds nested closer to the tree, as if drawn by its residual heat. Balance was now baked into the routine, but something darker was coming. Not doom, not another creature, not another breach, a test, because the wind was not just sending, it was scouting. Somewhere ahead, somewhere east, something was already resisting. A village that had heard the rumours and chosen denial, a place where a different kind of silence ruled, one born not of reverence, but arrogance, where children were seen but not believed, where wounds were covered too quickly, where stories were flattened into fables and warnings turned into bedtime fluff. The 7 were walking into it now, armed not with weapons but with memory, and just as the last of them crossed the eastern ridge, the sky blinked again. This time, not in light, in absence, a star gone, one fewer witness, because some truths still die in transit, and that too is part of the cycle, because even in systems crafted with brutal precision, etched into bark and blood and breath, there is loss, there is failure. Not every story gets carried, not every star stays lit. The villagers understood this now. The absence of that one celestial eye didn't just mark a moment, it warned them. Somewhere, a witness had been lost. Somewhere, memory had been smothered too soon. It wasn't enough to preserve what they had learned. They had to protect its passage. The 7 were the couriers, but the village was the archive. And archives burn easily, so they changed how they lived. Every ritual became redundant, doubled and tripled across layers of redundancy. Not for superstition, for fail-safes. When the wind blew too hard, they sang in opposing tones. When the moon looked strange, they burned chalk in a circle of 13. When a child had a dream they didn't understand, it was transcribed immediately and buried in a copper box beneath the fire pit. Everything was a potential omen. Everything was sacred, but they didn't isolate. They reached outward, carefully, quietly. At night, the crescent-eyed girl, still comatose, still glowing faintly beneath the tree, would murmur names. Not of people, of places, places that weren't on maps, villages no one remembered or claimed not to, and every time she named one, the wind would change, slightly. A shift in temperature, a bend in direction, as if the land itself was remembering. The villagers wrote each name in stone, creating a ring of unknowns around their borders. They knew some of those names were warnings, others, invitations. Let's go back a bit. In Sarmatian dreamcraft, the concept of the silent stone was central. These were not objects, they were moments, fixed points in memory, where the soul refused to bend, where truth planted itself too deeply to be dislodged. The crescent-eyed girl had become a living silent stone. Her body no longer needed to move. She was movement now, within time, within ritual, within consequence. Her mouth did not speak prophecy, it routed it, a conduit no longer human, but not yet divine. And just when it couldn't get more absurd, one of the children returned. Not from the east, from below, the spiral at the tree's base, which had long since cooled and sealed, split open without a sound. And from it emerged the child who had carried nothing. The one who had walked east with empty hands and eyes full of things no one dared to name. She returned alone. Face gaunt, eyes darker than nightfall. She didn't speak. She simply handed someone a stone, not carved, not inscribed, just smooth, warm, pulsing faintly. The recipient, a boy barely 10 winters old, held it and screamed. Not in pain, in remembrance. Something older than him had been downloaded into his bones. A history he hadn't lived, but now contained. He curled into a ball and whispered one word over and over. Flood. The village listened, not because they understood, because they believed, and just when silence seemed like the safest choice. The crescent-eyed girl opened her eyes, not white anymore, red, not glowing, reflecting. She sat up slowly, looked eastward, and said in a voice that sounded like gravel being stirred by wind, "One of them lied." The wind died instantly, not stilled, froze. Even the air stopped breathing, because now the real trial had begun, not of the world, of the seven. That was the fracture line, where the story, once layered and cyclical, threatened to snap. The crescent-eyed girl's words didn't echo, they settled, like ash after a funeral pyre. One of them lied, she had said, and that was all it took for the air itself to recoil. The wind, once so loyal, so deliberate in its eastward pull, now hung suspended, confused, insulted, because betrayal doesn't just rupture trust, it rewrites trajectory. The path the seven had walked was not sacred anymore. It was compromised, polluted. One of the vessels had warped the memory, bent it. Whether out of fear or arrogance didn't matter. The cycle had no patience for motive, only consequence. The villagers stood frozen, not from fear, from recognition. They knew what was coming, not from prophecy, from pattern. When a messenger fails, the message mutates, and just when it couldn't get more absurd, the stone the boy had been given cracked. Silently, internally, like something inside had hissed. He dropped it. It didn't fall. It slid sideways against gravity, against terrain, until it stopped at the tree's roots and sank into the earth like a needle slipping into flesh. The tree didn't move, but something underneath it did. A hum, a twitch, a warning. Let's go back a bit. In the oldest chamber, among the petrified trees and the stone children, there had been one carving no one spoke about. A spiral with a break in its line. They called it the Severance. It marks the only recorded time a ritual carrier had distorted their burden. The result wasn't death, it was infection. Memory turned inside out, sacred symbols reinterpreted as tools of vanity. That era had ended in a flood not of water, but of voice. Every person screaming a different version of the truth until the gods grew bored and left. Not punished, left. That was what was at stake now. The crescent-eyed girl stood fully, eyes red. voice gone. She no longer needed words. She turned to the spiral and stepped onto the first stone. The spiral reopened. Downward, welcoming her, or maybe judging her. Either way, she descended, alone. And the villagers watched like mourners who hadn't earned the right to grieve. One of the elders whispered, "If she fails, we fracture." No one argued, because they knew. Balance didn't die loudly. It died complicatedly. And just when you thought she'd vanish into the mist below, she screamed. Once, short, a note that was neither rage nor pain but command. From the earth, a new tree root exploded upward. Not soft, not wooden, stone. It pierced the air like a blade, veined with runes none of them had ever carved. This wasn't their language. This was hers, the witch's, a tongue not spoken since her final breath, now etched into fossilized bark. And as the stone root twisted skyward, the crescent-eyed girl re-emerged, unscathed, except for her hands, burnt black. Still open, still pulsing, she held them up and spoke just 3 words. "I've seen it." Her voice wasn't hers anymore. It was a chorus, 7 tones, each imperfect, each fractured, because something eastward was still unfinished. And now it was walking toward them, not as wind, not as omen, as form. No one knew what the fractured memory had become in transit, only that it was corrupted. Memory, when twisted, doesn't just lose its truth. It gains intent, like sour milk, with a will to spoil the rest of the feast. The villagers could feel it in their joints, in their dreams, in the blood crusting beneath their fingernails. The sky dimmed prematurely, not into night, but into a wrongness that made shadows freeze instead of stretch. The animals vanished again. Even the tree, now dormant and hollowed of its light, seemed to flinch. They braced, not for battle, for reckoning, because if one of the 7 had lied, the lie wasn't personal, it was structural, a wound sewn with the wrong thread. It would infect every ritual, every rune, every chant. It would retell their story incorrectly in places they hadn't yet visited. The consequence wasn't just failure, it was replication of failure. And just when it couldn't get more absurd, the crescent-eyed girl collapsed, not from exhaustion, from withdrawal. The chorus in her mouth, 7 tones, ripped themselves from her body in a burst of soundless rupture. Her body didn't bleed, it emptied, as though every piece of memory she held had been yanked out like organs through her throat. The villagers screamed, ran to catch her, but it was too late. She wasn't dead. She was reverted, her skin smooth, her bones too soft, her eyes wide and utterly unknowing. She had been reset. Let's go back a bit. Sarmatian rites held one unbreakable rule. The vessel must want to hold the memory, willingly, consciously. Not just endure it, but engage with it. If a carrier doubted, hesitated, or passed the burden incorrectly, the memory would not vanish. It would recoil, detach, seek a new host. And if none were found in time, the memory would evolve into something crueler. Not just history unlearned, history weaponized. The villagers had one option: find which of the 7 had lied, and reclaim the memory before it arrived. Twisted, but how? The remaining 6 were gone, scattered eastward, across lands not yet marked, into minds not yet awakened. And the lie? It could have been as small as a word, a rune drawn backwards, a feather placed too soon, a moment of silence held too long. The cycle had no leniency, no curve for human error. It required perfect recollection, because even a misremembered scream can become a song if echoed enough. And the wind had returned, this time not eastward, but backward, reversing its direction, dragging scent and static and dread across the village, like a god dragging its nails. The tree remained still, but the stone root, the one with the witch's tongue carved into it, began to glow. Not with fire, with frost. Runes iced over in sequence, like a lock being closed instead of opened. The language was trying to defend itself, but something darker was coming. A shape crested the ridge, human-sized but wrong. It shimmered as it moved, as if walking through overlapping layers of memory, all misaligned. A person who had lived 100 lives wrong. each one stacked like rotting parchment. The figure paused, then mimicked a greeting, hand to heart, head tilted, not hostile, just familiar. Too familiar, because it looked like one of the seven, but no one knew which, and it was smiling. Smiling like someone who'd heard the story too many times, and finally decided to rewrite the ending. That smile, thin, knowing, slivered with cruelty, wasn't worn by a child anymore. It was worn by a historian, the worst kind, one who doesn't just misremember, but reframes, who takes a wound and calls it a weapon, who wears forgiveness like armour and betrayal like perfume. The villagers didn't recognise the face, not fully. It had blurred edges, a blur of all seven, but the stance, the expression, the stillness at the centre of the form, that was unmistakable. One of the seven had come back twisted, and the twist wasn't in the flesh, it was in the story. It walked forward slowly, each footstep sounded like pages turning, but not parchment, skin. The land itself rejected its presence, grass browned beneath it, stones cracked, the spiral near the tree hissed and recoiled like a scalded animal. And yet the thing that had once been a child moved gently, like it thought itself still welcome. And just when it couldn't get more absurd, it spoke. Balance is just bias with better PR. Its voice wasn't its own. It was a collage, bits of all seven voices, cut and pasted together with the precision of a cruel editor, each word a scar from a different throat. The villagers recoiled, not because they feared the words, but because they understood them. Deep down, they knew the lie wasn't a single act. It was a philosophy, a decision made not to preserve memory, but to reshape it. Let's go back a bit. In the Forbidden Scrolls, those only ever read in dreams, the Sarmatians warned of echo curators. Not demons, not gods, but humans who had seen too much and decided they knew better. Who had once carried the truth and, in despair or delight, edited it, softened it, or sharpened it, always with purpose, always with a reason, and always with devastation as the outcome. What returned to the village now wasn't vengeance, it was versioning. The stone root cracked again, not violently. It peeled, opened like a book whose spine had finally given up, and from within, black dust began to rise, not smoke, not ash, ink, runes unspooling mid-air. Twisted versions of the ones once carved with reverence. These were corrupted glyphs, rewritten from memory by someone who thought they'd improved the recipe. They curled into the sky and began blotting stars from view. 1, 2, 3, until the constellation above the tree disappeared. Not dimmed, erased. The crescent-eyed girl, still reverted and dazed, began humming, a tune with no notes, only shape. She didn't know what it meant, but the runes did, because suddenly the corrupted figure stopped. Its smile faltered. It looked at her, not with anger, with recognition, as if remembering something unfinished, a sentence it had once refused to say. And just when you thought this memory could be unspooled like any other, it knelt. Not in surrender, in strategy. It placed one hand into the dirt. The dirt swallowed it up to the elbow. The ground shivered. A second hand emerged from the soil, not its own, smaller, burnt, trembling, and pulling itself out. The villagers stood frozen as the second figure emerged from the earth, small, shriveled, but unmistakably human. It wasn't just another corrupted child. It was a duplicate, a mirror, a draft, like someone had tried to rewrite one of the seven and accidentally printed both versions, one clean, one glitched. This second body looked half done, like it had been stitched together in a panic. Skin slick with memory that hadn't dried yet, eyes blind but aware. It gasped once, then locked onto the crescent-eyed girl with a stare that skipped light altogether. Pure void, and just when you thought it might collapse from incompleteness, it spoke too. I wasn't the lie, I was the insurance. The ground didn't tremble. The air did, as if the sky itself couldn't decide what version of the story was true anymore. Birds began falling from trees, not dead, just stunned, like they'd flown into a memory too sharp to pass through. The villagers did what they'd been taught. They carved the moment, not just symbols now, portraits, one hand drawing the real, the other drawing the reflection. They had no idea which would survive, but at least the truth would outnumber the lie, if only briefly. Let's go back a bit. In the earliest rites, the Sarmatians had warned of a moment called the folding, a time when memory, story, and form collapsed into each other so tightly that truth could only be found in paradox, not logic, not lineage, just contradiction sharp enough to draw blood. The folding wasn't a catastrophe, it was a test, to see whether a people could hold both versions and still choose reverence. The crescent-eyed girl began to shake, not in fear, in sync with the second figure. Their heads tilted together, their hands moved identically, and then at the same moment, both whispered, "It wasn't me." The corrupted one laughed, low mocking, but beneath the mockery was something exhausted, like a storm begging for landfall, and that's when the third figure appeared. No wind, no preamble, just there, standing atop the broken spiral with one hand full of fire, literal, crackling blue-black flame, smokeless and cruel. Not a child, not any more. One of the other seven, grown impossibly fast, as if pulled through time by the sheer force of narrative necessity. Their voice was calm, final, full of ache. "No one lied," they said. "We were rewritten." And then they threw the fire into the centre of the spiral. The spiral erupted, not with heat, with time. Years unspooled in a single heartbeat, past, future, parallel, discarded, all spilling upward, like a reverse waterfall. The village disappeared inside it, not physically, contextually. Every decision ever made here, every rite, every prayer, every mistake was suddenly visible, layered, impossible to untangle, and at the centre, three versions of the same soul stared at each other. The liar, the insurance, the witness, all silent, all valid, and just when it seemed they might destroy each other, they merged, not into peace, into a scream, louder than wind, deeper than silence, a scream that shattered every rune in the village. Because sometimes, balance doesn't return. Sometimes, it breaks in threes, and when it does, the sound is not thunder, it's clarity, the kind that slices, not soothes. The scream that erupted from that confluence of selves wasn't pain or rage or warning. It was removal, a stripping of every veneer the villagers had painted over history to keep it digestible. Every ritual smoothed too clean. Every story told in past tense to make it feel safer. It all burned. Not in fire, in truth, the kind of truth that doesn't set you free, the kind that sets you aflame. The village collapsed, not physically, contextually. Every building remained, every tree, every face, but the meaning dissolved, like someone had erased all the annotations on a sacred text, leaving only raw symbols, unreadable but familiar. The villagers stumbled through their own lives as if waking in someone else's dream. Children called their parents by wrong names. Water refused to freeze or boil. Bread tasted like ash or honey, depending on who chewed it. The world hadn't ended. It had become an argument, and just when it couldn't get more absurd, the three figures, now merged into a single, seething entity, began to split again. But not back into what they were, into what they could have been. A fourth version, something unscripted, unprophesied, unbound. It didn't speak, it didn't need to, it just stared at the villagers with a look not of judgment, but invitation, as if daring them to accept that this unstable, fractured, contradictory chaos was the new normal, and if they couldn't survive it, they'd be remembered only as another footnote, another village that failed to adapt. Let's go back a bit. Among the relics found buried deepest in Sarmatian soil, there was one that scholars had always ignored. A mask with no face, carved from black resin, so featureless it seemed to repel identity. They called it the Mask of None, but the oldest witches had another name for it, the Face of All Futures. It wasn't worn to conceal, it was worn to erase choice, to embody all possibilities at once, and to speak none of them. The new form bore that look now, not blank, potentialized. And the villagers, they began to hum, not in unison, in discord, each voice clashing, clawing, trying to dominate, until the very air became opinion. The runes cracked again. The tree remained still, but its shadow no longer matched its shape. Even time began to stagger. People reported memories they hadn't lived, wounds they never received, a baby born with the word "again" burned into its palm in red blistering script. And the crescent-eyed girl, she smiled, for the first time, not as a vessel, as a witness. She whispered to no one, this was always going to happen, not fate, inevitability, because when you feed memory to children and demand perfection, one of them will always rewrite the recipe, not out of rebellion, but out of need. And just when the villagers might have begged for a reset, the fourth version turned away, walked north. North, a direction no ritual had ever touched, no rune had ever mapped, no tree had ever leaned toward. It walked not to flee, but to plant, a new cycle, one that would never ask who lied, but only who dares remember next. The question didn't echo, it embedded into trees, into teeth, into the cold marrow of the villagers, who now stood surrounded not by ruins, but by options, because that's what the fourth version left them with. Not instruction, not prophecy, permission. It had walked north, yes, but it had also carved a path that had never existed before. A line in the dirt that pulsed with potential, not history. And for a people raised on rules, on rightness, on rituals repeated until their meaning dulled like old knives, that was more terrifying than any curse. No one followed. Not yet, because they were busy trying to translate the silence it left behind. The spiral, long a source of certainty, now spun inward on itself until it was just a dot burned into the earth. The stone roots snapped off and dissolved into spores, floating gently into the air like dandelion seeds made of salt and secrets. The crescent-eyed girl stood next to the void where the spiral had been and whispered, "We were the last village." And just when it couldn't get more absurd, someone laughed, not cruelly, not nervously, knowingly. An elder, blind in both eyes, shaking with age, he stepped forward and said, "No, girl, we were the first." And suddenly everything clicked. Let's go back a bit. In ancient Sarmatian code law, there existed a story within a story called the loop before the word. It was taught not in words, but through gesture. One hand mimicking planting, the other mimicking harvesting, simultaneously. The lesson was brutal, that sometimes what you believe you're remembering is only what needed to be believed first, not for truth, but for momentum. Every village believed they were the last to face the cycle, but someone always had to be first. The elder sat down, cross-legged, smiling. "Let them think we vanished," he said. "It's better that way, cleaner." The crescent-eyed girl nodded. She wasn't a girl anymore. She wasn't a witness. She was now the archive, eyes dull but vast, skin tight with rune burn, and dried ink veins. Her mouth no longer whispered, it stored. What had been ritual was now contained inside her. The question wasn't whether the village would survive, it was whether she would. And just when the wind returned, this time from the north, it brought back a voice, not human, not divine. New, it asked one thing. Do you still want to be remembered? No one answered, because they understood. This was no longer about remembering, it was about retelling. Each family chose differently. Some packed, some prayed, some simply stood there, letting the spores settle on their skin like a second inheritance. Children drew new symbols, not spirals, branches, wide, wild, asymmetrical branches, not for repeating, for reaching. The rituals that had bound them would now be scattered across paths unknown. Not forgotten, just unhooked. The fourth version did not return. It didn't need to, its gift was done, a crack in continuity that let something else in. And that something, it wasn't evil, it wasn't holy, it was possibility. And as night fell for the first time, without a single rune glowing, the villagers didn't light torches. They waited, in the dark, with eyes wide, ears open, hearts uncertain, because maybe, just maybe, this time, they wouldn't ask the children to carry the weight. They'd carry it together, And that changed everything. Not because cooperation was new. Villagers had always shared chores, shared bread, shared grief, but because this was the first time they dared share responsibility. Memory had always been a solitary burden, passed to the youngest, the softest, the most malleable. Children were chosen not for their strength, but for their silence. They didn't know how to resist, they only knew how to absorb. But now that cycle had been interrupted, violently, irrevocably. And as the spores settled, so did the truth. If the past was going to survive, it would have to belong to everyone. There were no rituals for this. There were no words, only gestures. A hand placed on a shoulder, a head bowed in acknowledgement, fingers tracing runes in the dirt, not to summon, but to disperse. No longer bound to strict geometry, the marks spilled like water, each one personal, each one valid. Even the crescent-eyed girl didn't object. Her gaze had turned inward now, tracking timelines and contradictions, and remnants of selves she no longer housed. She wasn't just the archive, she was the interface. And just when it couldn't get more absurd, the sky fractured. Not thunder, not light, a line, straight, clean, vertical, running from the top of the sky to the horizon, like a scalpel incision on a stretched hide. Through it, wind screamed, not with warning, but envy, because something had breached the story, something that hadn't earned its place, a memory that wasn't invited, and like a stray note in a sacred chant, it twisted everything it touched. Let's go back a bit. The Sarmatians feared two things above all: silence and unsourced memory, a tale without a teller, a symbol without a scribe. These weren't neutral, they were predatory. When left untethered, they latched onto belief systems and wore them like disguises. Rituals became performance, myths became mandates, devotion became dogma. And once that infection took root, truth became impossible to identify without pain. The villagers knew the signs now. The sky hadn't broken because of the fourth version. It had broken because something else had noticed the break, and it was coming through. Not a god, not a demon, a correction, a self-appointed editor of memory, designed by belief systems that no longer existed, but refused to die quietly. The tear in the sky began to widen, and from it spilled not soldiers or beasts, but rules, written in liquid metal, hovering mid-air like commandments. They circled the village, hissing, vibrating, imposing old logic on new chaos. One read, "Truth must be identical." Another, "Deviation is decay." Another, "Children are the cleanest parchment." The villagers read them and laughed, not out of joy, out of recognition, because they had worshipped these rules for generations, had engraved them into bone, whispered them into cradles, enforced them with love, sharp enough to scar. And now they saw those rules for what they were, artifacts of fear. They didn't run, they didn't fight, they sang, discordant, off-key. Raw every villager, old and young, raised a different melody, no two alike. The sound clashed and collided, folding around the hovering rules until the metal writhed and began to melt, not from heat, from incompatibility. And the sky, it sealed, slowly, like a wound that had been acknowledged instead of hidden. The wind quieted, the lines faded, but something darker was coming. Again, because with the sky sealed, they were truly alone now, and the next choice would not be made in ritual, it would be made in blood. Because once the sky seals, once no more guidance seeps through from the stars, the only compass left is the pulse in your throat and the tremor in your hands. And history, no matter how sacred, cannot replace instinct. The villagers had survived the spiral. They had endured the echo curator. They had even stared down a rewritten godling of their own making, but now came the part no one had prepared for. The quiet, the silence that follows revolution. The waiting room of the new. And silence, unlike screams, doesn't tell you what's next, but blood does. A child was found at dawn, not crying, not dead, split, not physically, temporally, half her face aged decades beyond the rest. One arm wrinkled like old bark, the other still plump with childhood. She was humming 2 songs at once, one from the old rites, the other from a tune no one recognised. She didn't speak. She only looked at the crescent-eyed girl and mouthed one word: reverse. And just when it couldn't get more absurd, the soil beneath the village turned warm. Not seasonally, intentionally, the roots of the great tree, long thought dead, twitched, slowly, carefully, as if remembering they were once alive. A pulse ran through the earth, dislodging old stones, pushing up relics long buried, masks, bones, tools, forgotten texts, all rising like they had decided now was the time to be found. The message was clear. The past wasn't done with them. It had simply been waiting for permission to speak in full. Let's go back a bit. Among the banned teachings, there was one fragment too unstable to be spoken aloud. The reversal rite. It was a ceremony of surrender, not to a god or to death, but to every possible version of the self that might have existed. It was banned not because it failed, but because it succeeded. Too many times, carriers who completed it returned fluent in contradictions. They spoke truths that unravelled villages. They made sense, and in making sense, they undid belief itself. And now, that rite was awakening itself. The villagers gathered in a circle. No instruction, no leader, only volunteers. Each one stepped into the centre, drew blood, and whispered not what they had done, but what they had almost done. Regrets, interruptions, near lies. It wasn't confession, it was calibration, honouring the selves they had never been allowed to become. The air shifted, not temperature, weight. The village grew denser, time grew heavier, as if every moment that had been skipped or silenced had come back to reclaim its place in the timeline. People remembered things that hadn't happened yet. Lovers mourned endings they hadn't reached. Elders laughed at jokes they hadn't heard. Memory lost sequence, and in that mess, freedom, but something darker was coming, not from the sky, from underneath. The tree's roots, still twitching, began to pull something up. Not a relic, not a spirit, a body, small, familiar. Rotten, it was one of the 7. The one thought lost on the eastern path. Her bones still carried the satchel, still held the rune blade, but her eyes were open and blinking. She wasn't a corpse, she was paused, a child frozen mid-step between memory and myth. And as her mouth opened to speak, no air, only silence, pure, awful, final. It was the kind of silence that didn't ask questions, it answered them. The girl, paused, preserved, partially rotted, stood in the centre of the village, like a punctuation mark. No one knew how to read. Her skin was cracked but not collapsed. Her fingers twitched, not from life, but from intention. She had something to finish, not to say, not to write, but to enact. Because memory, in the end, is a performance, and hers had been interrupted, frozen in time by a force too scared to let her finish her part. Until now, the roots beneath her pulsed again. Blood, fresh blood, leaked from her feet into the dirt, not hers, the village's, because what no one realised was that while they performed the reversal rite, they had offered more than truth. They had offered permission, and that permission had reopened her. She was the unclosed chapter, the page torn from the codex, the 7th version no one talked about because she refused to die properly. And just when you thought memory had no fangs, she opened her mouth and breathed, not air, not word, flame, thin, gold, silent flame that curled like smoke but cut like blades. It didn't burn flesh, it burned certainty. One by one, villagers fell to their knees, not in pain, but in memory. Their minds flashed through every moment they had rewritten, every choice they'd adjusted to make the story smoother, safer, more heroic, and the flame didn't punish. It catalogued with terrifying gentleness, like a scribe carving shame into glass. Let's go back a bit. There had once been a phrase in Sarmatian: to breathe the flame is to confront the edit. It was only used once in a generation, and only by those ready to see what they'd refused to remember. But no one alive had ever dared it in full. Until now, the villagers were not just remembering, they were being remembered back. The version of events that girl carried, the truth, was filling them, rewriting them from within, and it was devastating. Marriages evaporated in real time, friendships decayed, reputations collapsed, because the lie had not been in the ritual. It had been in the retelling. And the worst part, some didn't regret it, some liked the prettier version better. And the girl saw that. She saw everything. Her eyes, not human anymore, reflected not the village, but alternatives, possibilities, paths untaken. Every time someone blinked, they saw themselves differently. As coward, as hero, as bystander, as monster. The multiplicity was unbearable. People screamed not in pain but in recognition. The girl began to rise slowly, her feet no longer touching earth. Her satchel fell open. Inside it, not relics, not runes, just mirrors. Small, cracked. Enough for each villager. One by one, the villagers stepped forward, not to look in, to choose one. Each mirror carried a different version of their story, and the choice they made would lock it in forever. But something darker was coming. The mirrors weren't inert, they watched back, and one of them, the last one, it didn't reflect the village. It reflected you, not as you are now, but as you could have been, as you almost became, as you still might. And that, more than flame or false gods or fractures in the sky, was the real terror, because when a story ends, it usually closes a loop, ties a bow, gives you a moral, a lesson, a name to curse or canonize. But this didn't end in resolution. It ended in reflection, a final cruel mirror held up to everyone who had watched, listened, obeyed, and rewritten, and the mirror did not judge, it invited. The last girl, half preserved, half devoured by time, hovered higher, mirrors orbiting her like moons, each one still, silent, accusatory, but none cruel. The villagers stood frozen, mirrors in hand, story fragments coiled tight in their palms. Some cried, some whispered apologies to no one. One laughed and shattered his mirror underfoot. The shards reflected different things, each one a lie he wished had been true. And the mirror didn't resist, it simply absorbed the decision. Because memory isn't sacred, it's selective. And just when you thought it was over, the girl dropped. Fast, final, head first into the spiral's grave. No scream, no splash, just disappearance, like punctuation. At the end of a sentence no one dared read aloud. The mirrors, now untethered, began to crack, each one shattering at a different rhythm, as if in response to who had held them. Some disintegrated into dust, others bled. One turned to ash and spelled the word again across the dirt. The village began to breathe again, shallow, unsteady, like lungs learning air for the first time. Let's go back a bit. When the Sarmatians first began carving history into flesh, they believed they were preserving truth, but they misunderstood the body. It heals, it warps, it forgets. The scars they wrote didn't tell stories. They erased them, layer by layer, until only the outline of memory remained. They called this mercy. It wasn't. It was erasure dressed as tradition, and now their descendants had remembered too much. Enough to see what was never meant to survive. The crescent-eyed girl, no longer a girl, no longer anyone, stood alone now. Her eyes burned black with too many versions, her voice gone, her hands empty. She had given everything she was to the spiral, to the children, to the fire and the sky, and the fourth and the fractured. And still, she wasn't thanked, just watched. Because sometimes, being the vessel doesn't mean legacy, it means exile. She walked, not north, not east, just away, and the villagers didn't follow. They didn't know how. They weren't a village anymore. They were a disagreement wrapped in skin, each person carrying a version of the truth they had chosen, each one convinced it was the only one worth keeping. No rituals, no flame, just fragments, and fragments do not bury themselves. They spread. Years later, someone will find a rune etched into the underside of a child's jawbone, a spiral, but misshapen, looped in reverse. When asked what it means, they'll say it was part of a prayer, or a curse, or a lullaby meant to keep children asleep. But they'll be wrong. It wasn't to keep them asleep. It was to keep us from waking. So what does that say about us? That even in remembering, we choose the version that hurts less, or that deep down we know. Some stories shouldn't be told at all.